Hello everyone, messed up the intro a little bit there, but here we are live again with Chess Openings Explained. Today, of course, the line that I want to walk you guys through is the Fischer Sozin Attack in the Najdorf. Of course, it was a favorite of Bobby Fischer with the white pieces, and so that's why I put his picture on the stream today. But basically, what this line is one of the more aggressive variations in the Najdorf. It is one of the more theory-heavy variations, depending on what you choose to play with the black pieces. And there are quite a few fun lines that I want to show you guys tonight. And probably this is going to take so long that it will need another lecture. But we'll save that for now, for later, I guess. Let's just jump into it. The Sozin starts with e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and a6, arriving at the Najdorf. Of course, the first two lectures in the series were focused around the bishop e2 lines, which are sort of the calmer, slower, more positional sort of variations. And now today, I want to take a look at the move bishop c4 on move 6. This is sort of one of the main variations in the Najdorf to learn and to understand, and this is the start of the Sozin, or Fischer Sozin, however you want to say it. And black's next move is actually going to be really, really natural. So our opponent develops this bishop out to c4 rather than a square like e2. Obviously, this is a more aggressive square. Against the bishop e2 lines, we love to play the move e5, force this knight away, and then we can develop our pieces rather naturally behind this e-pawn. With bishop c4, this is going to be a little bit harder to achieve. If you play the move e5 here, already the move knight to f5 is going to be the issue. This, of course, isn't really playable after bishop e2, but here white has enough control over the d5 square to go ahead and play in this manner. So rather than a move like e5, the move e6 comes to mind. And this is the move that is the main move here in the Najdorf, and the idea is to stunt this bishop on c4. And now the variations that we're going to look at tonight basically all revolve around these lines where white is trying to break through on the e6 square. And so I'm going to talk about what I'm going to recommend with black and what white should really be doing against it. So, how can white break through this e6 square? Well, there's really two main ways. Way number one is eventually you'll see a piece sacrifice on e6. That's definitely one way to do it. But the main idea in many of the Fischer Sozin attack lines is to go f4, f5, and sort of chomp at this e6 guy in this manner. And so the line I'm going to recommend tonight is a pretty complex one. And the idea is basically to play against this idea of f4 and f5 by white. So after e6, there are really two main moves. White can go ahead and castle, but much more common is just to play the move bishop b3. And this bishop drops back to b3 for a number of reasons. The more obvious one is to step out of any b5 pushes with tempo. But also, occasionally, black is going to be pushing the move d5, and this would also be hitting the bishop, so it makes sense to drop the bishop back to a nice defended square here on b3. And now the main moves are to play b5 immediately, or to play knight bd7 here. But I'm actually going to recommend that you play the move bishop e7 in this case. And now these lines get very, very complex. Perhaps one of the critical variations is for white to play g4. And I think we are going to save this line actually for the next lecture, or if I end up having time, I will start going through these variations here as well. But for tonight, I want to focus on the main plan with f4 and this f5 idea. f4 can also be combined with the idea of e5 as we will see. And so after white plays the move f4, of course white can also castle here, transposing into the line where white castles here. If bishop e7, bishop e3, is by far the most common move. So bishop b3, bishop b7, and castles would transpose. So let's take a look at f4. And now after f4, things go a little bit wild. The move I'm actually going to recommend is a bit of a sideline. And the point here is that I want to play the move b5 immediately after this move f4 arrives on the board. And this is a move that has actually only been played, looks like 13 times in the database. And so understandably, there are some complex lines where white can try and pose some difficult problems to black. However, I'm hoping, I've done a number of hours of analysis of these variations. I'm hoping black is doing just fine in pretty much all of them. I will say that a lot of these lines are theory heavy, and I've mentioned that I'm using a few different resources to prepare these lectures, one of which is an excellent book by Alex Korovich on Chessable, where he goes over some lines in the Najdorf. It's called the Najdorf Simplified, I believe. And so if you want a slightly easier variation than the one I'm going to be recommending here today, I would definitely recommend checking out that Chessable course, because I think the lines that he recommended are a little bit simpler for black, but I do think these are quite a bit more fun. So b5 is the move I'm going to recommend. And now in the database, there are a few different moves that have been played. The move f5 has been played here, the move castles has been played here, the move e5 has been played, and then bishop e3, a3, and queen f3 all have, you know, one or two examples. And the most common moves are f5 and kingside castles here. Those have been played together 21 times, and I think both of those moves actually lead to a pretty decent advantage, or at least a very comfortable position for black. The main line you actually have to look out for is going to be this move e5, and that's where things get rather complex, and I think this is probably the reason this is not seen too often. So we're definitely going to delve deep into these e5 lines, but for the moment, let's take a look. I guess we'll go briefly over some lines after e5. D takes e5, f takes e5, knight f to d7, and now there are really two critical variations, bishop takes e6, and queen g4, which I'm definitely going to go over. But first, just to give you some idea of the kind of position we're dealing with, if white plays rather slowly, let's say something like bishop f4 or queen e2, just to defend this pawn, well, black is actually going to already have a pretty sizable advantage because e5 is going to be weak in the long run. White definitely needs to play immediately here, or he is very much going to end up in a slightly suspicious position. So for example, bishop b7 is natural development. Now with something like rook f1, going after this guy, a simple knight c6, and white is going to have to sacrifice immediately. If he doesn't, just plays like bishop e3, well, black's going to castle, and these pawns are already hanging, or just a simple development by black. And if black can achieve this, then black is, like I said, going to be significantly better here. Moves like knight c5 are coming, and moves like b4 are going to be coming as well. And this is just going to sort of fall apart quite quickly for white. The attack on the king side isn't really going anywhere. You see all of white's pieces are honestly kind of stranded over here on the queen side. Why would white play e4? Well, we're going to get over the critical variations in a minute. So bishop takes e6 should be played. And now if we actually capture this bishop, we're going to be in pretty dangerous territory here. I think black is lost if you capture the bishop, because this attack is just far too strong with pieces coming in and the e5 pawn on the board. But luckily black has a very, very good move here with kingside castles. And after this move, black should be doing quite well. White has to solve the issue of this bishop. The e5 pawn is hanging, and he has to solve the problem of what to do with these two pieces on the now half open, soon to be fully open e-file as well. For example, if knight takes c6, bishop c6, and the bishop retreats, you can already imagine a move like b4, knight d5, and bishop b5, and white could quite quickly be losing material. Okay. So that's your brief introduction on the position after the move e5. If white tries to play slowly, something like queen e2, we just develop our pieces, get castled, and don't allow any bishop takes e6 sacrifices. If white does take on e6, more often than not, kingside castles is going to be more than enough for an advantage for black, rather than accepting the piece in these main e5 lines that I'm talking about. Once again, those moves we just develop naturally and then end up already winning material. Okay, so let's move on now to the critical lines. So jumping in here, we have once again the same opening moves. E6, bishop b3, bishop e7, and f4 we're taking a look at. Now b5, and like I said, I think f5 and kingside castles both lead to advantageous positions for black, which we're going to get to eventually, but let's jump right in to the critical variations after e5. So takes, knight fd7, and now, like I said, these are the two critical moves to look out for. Every other move, black can sort of just develop normally. Brief honorable mention to queen f3, I should say as well. This move is not super critical. You just need to realize that you can play the move queen c7 here. And now queen takes a8 is not going to be very good due to bishop b7 when this queen is totally trapped. So queen c7, and then play would sort of develop normally, something like rook f1, kingside castles, this bishop gets developed, and something like bishop e7, and then black is once again doing quite well. So back to the critical variations. Let's start with bishop takes e6. Now I spent a number of hours on this move alone, trying to make different variations work. Kingside castles has been played twice from this position. This position itself has been reached 7 times from the database I'm using. And kingside castles was played twice. Knight takes e5 was played 5 times. In the 5 games where knight takes e5 was played, there are 2 wins for white and 3 draws, and black won both times he castled kingside. But I think castles kingside actually leads to an advantageous position for white. The key move is to retreat this bishop to d5, highlighting this rook, rook a7, and then after e6, the lines get very, very complicated, and black is more often than not going to be worse in these positions pretty significantly. So backing up, I took a look at the move knight takes e5, and I think this is the way to equalize with black here. Bishop takes c8 means queen takes c8. Now knight d5 is really the only move to try to press for an advantage. Other moves are fine for white, but if just castles, then black is going to be able to castle himself. And from here, development shouldn't be too difficult with the black king out of the center. So knight d5 is the way to apply the pressure in the position. Obviously, we're threatening this bishop on e7, we're threatening to go knight b6, and we're eyeing up this king after moves like queen to e2. And so this is definitely the critical move to look out for. Now I looked at various options here as well. In the 2 games that were played, in the 4 games that were played, bishop c5 was black's choice in 3 of them, and bishop h4 check was black's choice in 1 of them. And I do think actually this move, bishop h4, is going to be the critical line here. So bishop h4 check for black. G3 is the only move for white if he doesn't want his king stuck in these open squares. And now bishop back to d8 is removing this bishop from threat on e7 and protecting the b6 square. The obvious downside to this is we are leaving this knight just a little bit stranded here on e5. And so white's next move is very, very natural. You play the move queen e2 to try to challenge this knight. Now, in the game we were following between Nick Speck, who is a 2380, and Ivan Chaparnov, who is a 2550 at the time of playing, Chaparnov actually played the move f6 and went on to lose this game. And I do think f6 gives white a significant advantage, but the move knight d7 is the key move here for black. And black is definitely not out of the woods yet. This is, like I said, sort of the critical variation. And so this is where black is going to have the most problems, and this is also where you're going to have to kind of know your stuff. So if white now sort of plays slowly, just develops a bishop, well, a move queen c4 is going to be the way to solve all of black's problems. you offer this trade of queens, and you can even castle on this turn or after queen c4 as well, and then black is totally fine. So white needs to play sort of immediately if he wants to get an advantage here in this position. So John, once again, we did this strange bishop maneuver. We go bishop h4 to force g3 to weaken the f3 square, and then come back to d8 because we want to guard against knight b6, and also remove any ideas of knight takes e7. Knight b6, of course, with the fork in many cases. So queen e2, knight d7, and bishop f4 is one of the two critical moves here. Bishop f4, the obvious point is we are challenging this knight on e5. And at first glance, this is very much not an easy issue to solve. If you play the move f6 here, trying to solidify, knight f5 is going to kind of kill you. There's really not much that can be done here after knight f5. If you castle, well, look out, this is also going to win your queen. So the move here for black that you have to find is the move queen c5. You sort of counter the threat to your knight on e5 by threatening both of white's loose knights in the center. And now after bishop takes e5, you might think that, you sort of had an empty threat because obviously you cannot take here due to bishop d6 check when you lose a full piece, but you can in fact simply castle. And this is sort of the craziness of this line, is you allow white to capture this knight and you don't take it back immediately. The good news now for black is white has too many problems to solve to actually keep a hold of this piece. He has this knight hanging on e4, this bishop about to be hanging on this knight hanging on d5, this bishop about to be hanging on e5 if the knight were to move, and the queen and king stuck in the center on the same file. So there's not much to be done here for white to actually maintain any sort of advantage. If the bishop retreats, we're happy to capture this guy. Now actually it's going to be white in significant trouble, unable to castle queenside due to this, and both of these pieces hanging. So white has to sort of find some clever moves, like queen e4, trying to defend everything. And now the obvious move is the correct move for black. You bring the rook to the file, put it opposite the enemy king and queen, and pin this bishop as well. Now white must castle or else he's going to be worse. If any other move, like knight b3, challenging the queen, we are happy to offer a trade of the queens here, and then simply collect our bishop back on e5. Once again, this rook pinning the bishop to two different pieces. Hello to Tukabri, Nabil. Hello, everyone. Hello, Albert. So queenside castles by white makes the most sense, removing the king from the center, and bringing the rook to the d file as well. And now one more slightly strange looking move by black, and the game is sort of over, meaning black has totally equalized and white will never really be able to get any sort of advantage. And that move is knight f6. This is the last key move to find for black here, and the point is you are obviously attacking these two pieces, and you're attacking this bishop as well. So if knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, and this pin is maintained, along with this rook on a8 being well defended. And then play might continue, knight f3, bishop takes e5, and then one more trick by white, rook d5. But of course this doesn't amount to anything after bishop d6. Unveiling a threat to the queen, and also cleverly defending the black queen as well. Play might continue with queen d3, queen e3 check, takes, when we have an obviously drawn endgame here. If anybody's better, it might be white, but this endgame very, very clearly should be a draw. Play might continue with rook d1, threatening checkmate, something like h5, something like b3, g6, and then both sides are going to aim to activate their rooks, and it's actually black's rook on f3 that is sort of really crucial here, defending the f7 point, so any ideas of doubling on the 7th rank aren't going to be amounting to too much with this actively placed rook, sort of dealing with those threats well enough. You could never draw it. Well, with which side, I think, is a fair question, because this endgame should be pretty well drawn. Okay, so that was critical variation number 1 in this line with bishop f4. So once again, bishop f4, key move defined is queen c5. After bishop takes e5, this is the really only move for white. If he tries anything else, we are collecting this free piece and perhaps even saving this one. So bishop e5, now black must castle with the idea of bringing the rook to e8. Now white must defend this knight on d5. If the knight moves, we can just collect our piece back. So queen e4 gets played, and now rook e8 is the key move for black. Once again, keeping the threat to both these pieces. White now has to castle, and now knight f6, and we are totally out of the woods here. Once again, this sort of funny variation to finish things off. Okay. Yeah, one move nearly dictates the outcome of the game. Yeah, these are the kinds of positions that can crop up in the Najdorf. So that was after the move bishop f4. This is sort of white's first try to get any kind of advantage here, going after the knight on e5, and I think it's the most natural try. However, white could also attempt the move knight f5. This move also looks rather tempting. Threatening knight d6 with check, and knight takes g7 is sort of a devastating threat at first glance. What if instead of knight f6, rook takes e5? Yeah, let me show that really quickly. If you take this guy, unfortunately, the move knight e7 check is going to be the issue here, with the rook on a8 falling. Now, in the previous lines, whenever this knight moved, you could take here, and your rook defended your other rook on a8, but this is not possible after rook e5. If knight takes e5, this is sort of playable for black, but rook e1 is going to be a small problem when dealing with this pin to the rook could end up giving black a little bit of trouble. So knight f6, the simplest move to equalize. Now, rather than knight f4, back to knight f5. And luckily for black here, the key move is the same move as against bishop f4. We need to play queen c5. This is really just the best move that black can play in these types of positions, activating the queen, threatening the powerful knight on d5, in this case defending d6, and indirectly defending the knight on e5 as well. Now, once again, white needs to sort of deal with this piece on d5, so the move queen e4 comes to mind, keeping this pin, keeping these threats, and now black is simply going to castle. Note, if knight takes g7 here, king f8 is actually attacking two pieces at the same time, and so this is really not going to be playable. If bishop h6, we'll take this guy, and now there's really no good discoveries here for white. The king is going to run to g8, and we are actually pretty well defended on that side of the board for the moment. And if a move like rook f1, king g8 is a good move for black anyways. And if rook d1, something like queen c6 makes sense. And the white pieces are slowly but surely going to have to start retreating. One very forcing line, for example, rook takes d7, you can actually take on h6, queen takes e5, queen takes g7, check, queen f8, takes, either rook takes, and black is going to be slightly better here. Despite the actively placed rooks, a full bishop is a full bishop. If white tries to keep the piece, for example, well, now you're sort of asking for trouble with this bishop and rook coming quickly into the game. Okay. So knight takes g7, definitely scary, but I do think black has enough options there where you can sort of play your way out of it over the board, because in the long run, black is going to be up a piece and is going to have sort of just a winning position if played well. So queen c5, queen e4 is the only move for white to not be worse. Castles, bishop e3 makes sense to develop with tempo. Note now, if something like bishop f4, we are once again relying on this tactic of knight f6 to sort of get us out of dodge here. And this would, in fact, be good enough. If takes, we will take. If check, we can take. And sort of take with check. And get our pieces sort of to safety. c3, rook e8. And once again, black is doing fine. So bishop e3, now the only move for white really. Queen c4, and this now offers a trade of queens. And once again, if we go into the endgame, black is going to be doing well after this move, rook e8 check, king f2. And the reason I think black is going to be doing pretty well here is because the king sort of lacks safety on the f2 square. So if the black rooks ever get active, which they likely will eventually, this king is going to be actually worse off than the black king. That being said, there are some very concrete threats happening on the king side, so black's going to have to be a little bit careful here. That being said, there are a number of moves that equalize here with black. You can simply offer a trade of knights, when moves like knight takes g7 aren't going to be playable due to this, and if takes, bishop takes. Or you can go for slightly more with a move like g6, sort of dealing with this knight immediately. And now knight h6 check is actually going to be a bit of a mistake because these knights are going to come back to the e5 square, and it's actually white's knight that ends up in a little bit of trouble in this variation. Okay. So obviously though, white is not forced to trade queens. If bishop d4 now, once again the natural move rook e8 is the way to go for black, challenging the king and queen along this e file. Now if queenside castles, if white doesn't queenside castle, then once again white is going to end up being a little bit worse off in this variation. And the reason for that is, for example, if white tries to be clever and saves this knight, attacking this queen, attacking this rook, we have bishop a5 check. And once again, this king's going to have to move. If he goes c3, knight d3 check is killer. And so, for example, king f2. Now, if knight d3 check, white could capture. So instead, a move like queen e6, saving the queen. And once again, it's going to be white's king that's actually worse off than black's in this variation. So after bishop d4, rook e8, white must queenside castle, and then black can go ahead and take on e2, and should take on a2. Sorry, a2, not e2. Now, after knight d7 check, or knight f7 check, knight fe7 check, really they're the same. They're the only moves for white to not sort of lose immediately due to all this pressure on the queen side. We will capture, of course, to defend our rook on a8. Knight takes e7. Now we cannot take again, otherwise our rook would hang, but the move king f8 is playable. And now the only move for white, once again to not lose, is to take on h7. And now, if you're feeling dangerous, you can go ahead and take this knight, but it does turn out that this should just be a draw, and so it makes a little bit more sense to take a repetition immediately with the move queen a5 here. Queen a1, queen a5. And white really has no way to deviate, otherwise white will have a lost position. For example, if something like c3, now king takes e7 is going to be winning, because we can run to the d file now, since our opponent's king is sort of interfering with his own play here. And so this would end the game in a draw. So I know that that was a lot to cover, but those are really all the critical variations involving bishop takes e6 here. Once again, let's review how we got here, right? We have, of course, the Najdorf, the Sozin, bishop c4, e6, bishop b3, bishop e7, and now f4 is sort of the most aggressive try for white, b5, e5, takes, knight back to e7, and now we're looking at bishop takes e6 here. Once again, I think the only move for black to equalize is knight takes e5. We see the bishop trade. Now knight d5 is the attacking move to try to force an advantage. We have bishop h4 check, g3, bishop d8, queen e2. Now not f6, but rather knight d7 is the only move for black. And now after bishop f4, we go ahead and play queen c5 and castle to get out of danger, with rook e8 and knight f6 to follow. And then we have this forcing line that leads to an equal endgame. Okay. Also, instead of bishop f4, white could try the move knight f5, going for threats like this, and the move queen c5 is going to be good enough for black. If queen e4, we castle, bishop e3, queen c4. If bishop d4, once again, rook e8 is the way to go. And now white has to go for this forced line with queenside castles, or else he will be a bit worse as the black pieces untangle themselves. So queenside castles, queen a2, we saw check, and takes, and then this simple repetition. Okay. So, I said before that these lines with bishop takes e6, I think these are really the critical variations. The move queen g4, I think, is also going to end up being critical, and so I'm going to go over that one next. But first, does anybody have any general questions about this bishop takes e6 stuff? Honestly, this is the one line that kind of made me not want to recommend these moves, because this one is quite forcing, and at the end of the day, it does end up in this equal endgame. But black really has to know their stuff, or else black is going to be worse here. The reason I decided to recommend it anyways is because, number one, players with the white pieces historically have not played like this very often, and number two, there are just as many chances for white to go wrong and end up with a worse position as there are for black. And so I think if you end up in a position like this over the board, the better prepared player is going to be the one that ends up with the advantage. So if you think that's you, I definitely recommend going for these lines. If you don't think so, if you don't want to sort of put in that little amount of work, then you can still play like this, but just understand after bishop takes e6, you're going to have a hard task ahead of you. Okay, so now let's look at the move queen g4. I have another chapter for this because there are also a lot of lines, so let's jump into it. We have the Sozin, e6, bishop e7, f4, b5, and now there are all these other moves that I want to take a look at as well, but we're still focusing on e5, de5, fe5, knight d7. Now in the last chapter, we looked at all these lines with bishop takes e6 and knight takes e5. Now let's look at queen g4. This is sort of the other critical line here for white. Okay, and the good news again for black is that the key move for black here is the same as it was previously. And that, of course, is the move knight takes e5. And I want to just tell you straight up, the move queen g4 has never been played in the database that I've seen. And the reason for that is it's actually going to be white running a lot more risks than black in these variations. That being said, this is one of the very, very forcing variations, and if black doesn't play well, then black is going to be lost. So we should definitely take a look at it here. But I just want to give you that preface that this has never really been seen over the board, and this is all just moves of my own making here. So knight takes e5, and now actually the only move for white to not lose is the move queen e4. If you get a little greedy and try to take this guy, don't forget that this guy is hanging, so bishop g3, or bishop f6 is going to be good enough. Queen g3 cannot be played due to this idea, and if queen h6, now this guy is going to hang. And this tactic saves our own bishop. So queen takes g7, not playable. Only move to not lose is queen e4, when we seem to have a fork. But now I'd like to pose sort of a tactics puzzle to the chats. What can we do here with black? There's only one move to not lose. How do you stop f4 by white in these lines? Well, if you mean f5, we're going to take a look at f5. These lines in particular make f5 actually pretty bad for white, which is why I'm kind of saving them for later, because they're really not that good for white, even if they have been played. Muhammad says queen c7, and that's actually not quite it in this case. Queen c7 is a good idea normally to try and trap the queen on a8, but in this case, the move bishop f4 is going to sort of put an end to your hopes and dreams. If this move bishop d6, now all of a sudden we take here. And if bishop c5, look out, because you have trouble on trouble on trouble with knight takes b5. And black is going to be lost after queen c7. Queen b6, I think, runs into a lot of the same issues. The idea here for black is actually the very counterintuitive bishop h4 check. Now, why on this earth is bishop h4 check the only move to save the position for black? Well, the point is it's a bit of a trap. White would love to play the move g3, but after g3, white is, of course, just much worse. After the move, dun dun dun, queen takes d4. Once again, this bishop h4 check move comes in handy to weaken the white king side, in this case directly with tactics. And here there's simply no way for white to sort of come back into this game. If white trades queens, you have knight f3 check, king f2, knight takes d4, g takes h4. And now black is actually a pawn up, with these two pawns being very, very weak. If g takes h4, we have something similar here. And if the move queen takes a8, going for the exchange, now the move knight e to c6 is once again sort of corralling this queen, and we have a much, much better version of lines that we were looking at with queen c7 directly, because our queen is very actively placed, and we have right now a full piece in exchange for the rook. If white gets greedy, tries to take this guy, we take with check, go ahead and castle. Rook g1, there's really no way to even try to save this queen, by the way. If something like this, we can just take back. Queen a3, this isn't really helping. Knight d4, and you're sort of just checkmated, unfortunately. So rook g1 instead, and now rook d8, and black is going to have sort of a crushing attack here. Bishop g5, queen h3 check, king e1, and there are plenty of moves now that win for black. Let's go with the simple rook d7, when it's becoming clear that the queen is not actually going to be saved. Rook d1 would be an attempt to save the queen, but now queen takes h2, hits this guy, knight e2 for example, bishop b7, and the end is near for this queen. And a winning position for black. Okay, so all that in mind, white doesn't have to play g3. Just pointing out that this g3 move is in fact sort of just totally lost for white, or at least a very, very uncomfortable endgame down a pawn with these fractured h-pawns. So instead, the only move for white to not lose is the move king e2. And that's why I think this has never really been seen over the board, because like I said, your opponent has to be very, very, very brave if they want to play king e2 in this position, and they have to be very, very accurate if they're not going to lose the game. Unfortunately, black also has to be very, very accurate, which is sort of the downside. If, for example, the move king d1, obviously this pins the knight, and knight c6 wins. If king f1, now queen f6 is going to be check. Knight f3, for example, knight takes f3, g takes f3, and just castles. And once again, white is not going to be in time to capture this piece, because queen d4 is just checkmating immediately. Knight e4, for example, and now queen d1 check. We chase the king up the board. E5 check is good. King takes h4, queen g2, threatening some checkmates, and we are starting to collect all of white's pieces while his king remains checkmated, sort of on the h4 square. So once again, with accurate play, white is never really able to capture this rook on a8. So king e2 instead, and now b4 is the key move for black. Once again, so in this position, rather than castle the king, do any of that, save either of our hanging pieces, maybe even retreat this bishop to a normal square, we play the move b4, and that's sort of the ridiculousness of this variation. Once again, queen takes a8 is going to be a huge mistake due to queen takes d4, and bishop e3 is not enough to save the game, because queen g4 check is going to be very, very strong. And once again, we can sort of retreat back with this knight eventually. Can also capture on c3. For example, king f1, b takes c3, queen takes b8, queen f5 check, king g1, castles. And while black is very technically down a rook for, just down in exchange for the moment, of course black is going to be totally winning here due to the placement of the king and the rook, as well as the white queen being totally out of the game. So once again, white can never really capture on a8, so b4. The really only move for white is queen takes c5 or rook d1 followed by queen takes e5. So let's take a look. Queen takes e5, now b takes c3 to regain the piece, and rook d1. Of course, this could happen in another manner with rook d1 first. Now b takes c3, and still, really, the move for white is going to be the move queen takes e5 here. So that transposes, and now we will castle in this position. And now this is, sort of going even further down the rabbit hole. I look like Bobby Fischer? Interesting. I have not heard this one before. And now, once again, we are on move 15, and there are only 2 moves for white that maintain the balance here. Every other move ends up going in black's favor. The simple one is knight takes e6, and I think this is the much more natural move that you would be likely to face here. Of course, this is attacking many pieces at the same time. Black would be forced to play queen f6, queen takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight takes f8, and now we immediately regain the exchange with bishop g4. For example, king f2 or king e1. Let's say king e1, for example, bishop takes d1, and now king takes d1 would be a bit of a mistake due to c takes b2. So rook b1 would be the move instead. And now, for example, a move like bishop g4, bishop d5, rook a7, b takes c3, rook e7 check, king f2, bishop e5, and it's actually going to be white who has to work very hard to sort of extract this knight from the position. Also potentially possible for black is to capture on b2 first, and this is going to end up in much simpler variations where we sort of save this guy directly. Although actually, no it's not, because bishop d5's a problem, so you would have to play king takes f8 here. So never mind me trying to give a simpler variation. Of course, just play the complicated variation with bishop g4, and you should be fine. And once again, it's really only black who can be better here, thanks to the awkward position of this knight. Okay, so once again, that's after castles. The simple variation is knight e6. We develop our queen. We go into this forcing variation. And now after rook b1, there are sort of a few different options for black. You could even take on c2 and take on f8. And sorry, this is the simpler variation. And now white would have the 2 bishops, but black is going to have the better pawn structure, and for the moment is technically up a pawn after this sort of variation. Okay, so knight e6 means queen f6. Everybody's on board. Now the complicated variation is if white goes queen e4. And this is sort of more of a losing attempt than a winning attempt. It's important now for black to find the move a5, which might not occur to you at first, but the idea is to simply checkmate the white king in the center of the board using these very powerful bishops. And now the only move for white that doesn't lose is to block this diagonal. Of course, if white captures on a8, we are happy to give this check. Rook d3 now is sort of forced, and we are already capturing here. If the king comes up the board, look out, queen f6 and queen f2 are sort of checkmating. Just for example, knight f3, queen h6 check, and this king has no squares, so it comes up the board, and this is a king hunt if I've ever seen one. And this guy is dying. Just dying, I tell you. Just dying. Look at how dead he is. It's terrifying. Super dead. Okay. So, of course, your opponent will not take on a8 if they're smart, and instead play the move bishop c4. Really against anything here, bishop a6 is a good reply. Even like a4, bishop a6 check, and you're winning for a lot of the same reasons. If knight b5, knight d7. And the weakness of this king isn't going anywhere. Okay, so a5, bishop c4 is the only move. Bishop a6 now anyways. Bishop back to d3 is the only move now for white, suddenly creating threats on the other side of the board. And now the fun forcing moves sort of begin with the move f5, hitting the queen. Now, if white doesn't want to lose, he has to take on f5. If queen f3 or queen e3, for example, will just simply develop. Queen takes a8. Of course, we're still taking on d4, and this is still winning. Bishop takes a6 isn't good enough because of this. So f5, knight takes f5 is forced. I'm sorry, yeah, queen f3, just queen f6, and we are developing normally. So knight takes f5 is forced. Now we take with check, rook takes d3, queen f6, and now white's only move is knight h6 check, g takes h6, rook f3, queen g6, rook takes f8, king takes f8, and now white finally takes on a8 and doesn't lose because of it. So now we have queen takes c2 check, king e3 or f3, and pretty much no matter what, this is going to end up in either a perpetual check, or if black can get the queen to the e5 square, defending the knight, then black can take on b2 and actually be sort of marginally better in an endgame. So, for example, king e3, bishop g5 check, king f3, queen f5 check, king g3, queen e5 check, king h3, and now black could either try to repeat directly with queen f5, queen d3, or take on b2 and go for this sort of endgame, where he ends up with a knight and a bishop for a rook after something like queen f3 check, bishop f6, takes and takes, when neither side should really be much better here. Just another line, if king f3 first, we can check, 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 and now king takes h4 would be a bit of a mistake due to queen takes f4, and now once again c takes b2 is going to be quite strong here for black. Okay, so once again, that line is after castles. If your opponent is super daring, they may play the move queen e4. Now your move is a5 to attack this king in the center of the board. If bishop c4, bishop a6, and f5, then you get the queen out, take a free knights, and go for this perpetual check. This is sort of the very, very forcing line for white to sort of escape. I honestly doubt anyone would ever really face this over the board unless they came in super prepared, which is why I still feel comfortable recommending these lines. I just want to make you aware of their existence. Like, this has never happened in a game, but I do feel that these are some critical lines in this bishop c4 variation that I'm recommending, which is why I feel the need to sort of cover them in detail. Because if you don't know anything going on here, you're likely going to get rolled over if some guy with some home cooking comes at you. And lastly, if your opponent tries to play something like knight f3, this sort of just loses to natural development with knight d7. Queen e4 now, we take the opportunity to bring our bishop back into the game, and queen takes a8 is sort of not enough after cb2 and bishop b2, when this is a comfortable exchange sacrifice with this queen threatened already once again on a8. So there you go. So any questions on this queen g4 line? Once again, I think this is sort of more of a losing attempt by white than a winning attempt, but black does have some moves that he needs to find that are sort of counterintuitive, which is why I felt the need to go over this in depth. So queen g4, we take on e5, queen e4, we give this check. g3 is impossible because the queen takes d4, king e2 instead. Now b4 is the key move. Queen takes knight is forced, b takes c3, rook d1, we castle. Knight takes e6 is the simple line, queen f6, trade, trade, take, check, take, and you end up in this endgame. Or we have the move queen e4, when you should play a5 and checkmate the king in the center of the board, with a fun little forcing variation to arrive at a draw. a5 is so hard to find. Once you see it, though, it makes a lot of sense, which is why I hope it'll stick out, because it really is just sort of checkmating this king in the center of the board. Okay. Yeah, g6 here is going to be less good because of actually now the move knight f3. When this queen is sort of under threat, this bishop is under threat, and it's difficult to solve all these problems at once. So you need to do something with tempo, which is why you arrive at the move f5. Okay. Oh, and g6 in this position is kind of just bad, because bishop h6, knight takes e6, still queen e4 I think is a problem. A number of moves in this position would be an issue. Wow, apparently I picked a picture of Bobby Fischer that really looks like me. I did not intend this, but sounds good, I guess. Okay, so that was pretty much all of the variations after the move 8f4 and 9e5, which I really think is the critical variation against this bishop e7, b5 setup. We do have a little bit of time left, so I'm going to try to go over some sidelines in this sort of variation. So bishop e3, bishop e7, f4, b5. Now we've gone over pretty much everything that happens after e5, but white, of course, has other options besides e5 here. Now, I really do think e5 is the only way for white to kind of keep the balance and play for any kind of advantage. I think after every other move, it's actually black who's fighting for an advantage here, which is why I sort of saved these for the end. So immediately you might be tempted to play the move f5 with white, but this simply allows the move e5, and now black is going to be pretty significantly better. This knight has to vacate, it can come back to e2, but now bishop b7, and already this e4 pawn is sort of a staggering weakness. Now knight g3 would be required to defend this pawn, knight bd7 though, and we're coming out to c5 and putting even more pressure here. Bishop g5 is already sort of required to take away an attacker, but just a move like h5 is threatening to take away the knight from the defense of the pawn. For example, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, and black is sort of much better here. I think the engine gives something like -1.3, and it's all because white's structure is sort of just horrible and awful. Expect moves like rook c8 to follow, moves like queen c7 aren't bad as well, queen b6 is another option, and we're going to start pushing on the queen side with moves like b4, and even a5, a4 threats in some positions. Also keep in mind that this bishop can get active in various ways. It can come out on this diagonal. It can actually occasionally come out this way as well, depending on how the play progresses. But like I said, black should be the one for choice here. Okay, so that's f5. Just not very good for white. If white castles here, then we transpose into some lines where white castles before playing bishop e3. So I'm going to go over all of those sort of together at the same time, so we'll hold off on that for the moment. If the move queen f3, then I like the move bishop e7, just putting the bishop opposite the queen, and after a3, this is sort of going to be rather uncomfortable for white once again. a3, of course, to stop b4, because we are threatening to take on e4. We just play knight bd7, and white likely has nothing better than to go for this. And this is sort of already just a worse version of the same. The queen on f3 is not really better than the queen on d1. Okay. If bishop e3, this is sort of the most sensible move aside from castling. The move b4 does really come to mind. Now the knight will have to vacate to a4. And actually here, knight takes e4, taking the free pawn, I think is a bit of a mistake. So don't kind of fall into that trap. That's why I felt this line was important to mention. If you take on e4, well, the issue is you're going to be met with the move f5. And you're not really going to have a good response to this. Normally against f5, we liked to play the move e5, but of course now the move bishop d5 is sort of going to be a huge issue here. That's not the only thing wrong, though. Also now, the move knight e6 is going to be powerful without this knight on f6 to guard the key square on d5. Also, this move might even start coming to mind for players with the white pieces. Note, all of those lines here don't really make any sense because we can simply take everything. And here, where there would be queen d5, if our knight wasn't here, there is no queen d5, and black is simply winning. So bishop e3, a bit of a trap to take this guy because f5 is quite strong, but we can develop simply with the move castles, and bishop d7. And now the point of bishop d7 is we are finally threatening to actually take this guy. For example, if white passes, we take on a4 and take on e4. And this is just an extra pawn. Now there's no bishop here to give us problems, and we should be doing quite well. In fact, if white passes, we could actually take here first and sort of just keep this threat in our pocket of taking on a4, because now all of these moves are going to be a little bit worse due to the fact that this knight is hanging on a4 at the end. So bishop d7 actually makes a threat here, which means it's probably time for white to just kind of bear down and defend this pawn, and then we can switch to normal development with something like knight c6. Just for example, play might continue c3, take on d4, take on d4, bishop c6, c takes b4, and after something like rook b8 and a5, once again, I think black is going to be a bit better here, with black definitely regaining this pawn on the queen side and pressure on the e-pawn as well. Okay, so those are sort of those sidelines after the move f4, b5. The one I haven't mentioned so far is a3, which is also sort of a reasonable move, but I do think black can get a slight edge after something like bishop b7, going after the e4 pawn once again. And now, if queen f3, we would transpose to this line that we've looked at with, let's see, what did I recommend? With knight bd7 and f5, e5. And if white tries something else here, for example, queen e2 would be a better try, not to step onto this diagonal, or a move like, yeah, let's say queen e2. Has anything else really been played? No, not really. Queen e2. Now this would be a bit of a trap if we played the move knight bd7, because we actually sort of need this square for our knight. So rather than knight bd7, simply castles. And now if f5, e5, and if castles by white, we can finally play the move knight bd7, thanks to the fact that we have some tactics to our name having to do with the knight on d4. For example, e5 means takes, and bishop c5 is already going to be quite good. Bishop e3, queen b6. If rook to d1, for example, we can already take this guy. If takes on f6, for example, we simply take here and are doing quite well. Okay. And if f5, we still fall back to e5 and are happy to go with our usual counterplay against the e4 pawn. And now I kind of want to stress this. In this move, f5 has been played 11 times, which I think leads to a direct advantage for black after e5 and bishop e7. As I said, castles has been played 10 times, which I also think is good for black after bishop e7. And e5 has only been played 9 times, which falls into those critical variations that I was talking about. And so more than 2 out of 3 times here, players with the black pieces have ended up with an advantage. Now, if your opponent really knows their stuff and they know that e5 is the best move here, you will have to be a little bit prepared. But I think more often than not, you're going to be playing against players using sort of suboptimal variations here. And then it's very easy to just get an advantage. You know, you develop these pieces so naturally, and the e5 pawn often just falls off the board. So that's why I really like recommending this line for black. Now we are just about out of time for tonight, so I wanted to briefly mention everything we've gone over. We've gone over the lines with first bishop b3 here, and now after f4, b5, I think we have covered pretty much everything aside from the castles variations in this line. So this is sort of the position that I have totally covered. So if there are any questions from this position forward, let me know now. Other than that, I'm going to briefly now mention what I haven't covered and what you can expect in the next lecture, and then I think we're going to call it here. So as for things I haven't covered, there's actually a critical move, g4, in this position that I want to go over. There's also all the variations involving castles, including the ones where white castles immediately. And also there are some variations to look at here with just something like bishop e3 and other sidelines. So basically, sidelines including quiet moves like bishop e3 just developing, the variations where white castles early, and the move g4 in this position are the ones left to cover. Why not queen f3, move 8? Yeah, we can talk about queen f3 as well. But that's also going to have to be for the next lecture. I think in general, it's not so good to blockade this pawn in, and we will talk a little bit about this maneuver, but you normally see this after white has already castled. Okay, so thank you very much for joining me tonight for this part 1 lecture of the bishop c4 Sozin. The lines I went over tonight are really the heaviest lines theoretically wise. So if you survived this lecture and you're still interested in playing these lines as black, the rest should be a piece of cake after bishop c4. Isn't bishop g5 also an option? Bishop g5 has been played 8 times here, and yeah, I'm likely going to end up covering this as well. But it is a bit of a sideline. g4 and the castles variations are the main stuff for next lecture. Okay, so thank you all so much for joining me here tonight. Hopefully you enjoyed this lecture. If you're watching live, be sure to check us out on the Twitch channel right after this, where I will be back with a tactics class. It's tactics time tonight. If you're watching the YouTube video, that's all for tonight. Once again, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Caleb Denby. I will see you next time.